Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by BlackSheep. If you're not them, I hope you'll enjoy listening. Let's see what they have to say. Salutations, Mr. Pants. A discussion on a spicy topic, randomness in card games. The double-edged sword players and game designers alike are obligated to live with and master. Or are they? Sometimes we savor this and sometimes we scourge it. It's a big topic that encompasses mainly two separate aspects of card games, turn order and drawing. You'd like to focus on the card drawing aspect today. Turn order deserves a future analysis all its own. Yeah, I agree. So why do we introduce randomness in card games when it comes to how a deck should be stacked? I have an answer of my own, and I'd like to hear yours. My own opinion is that randomness has a first and foremost function to create an even playing field for all players. This is because, in a perfect world where all things are fair and balanced, shuffled, read random, decks give every player equal chances of enacting their game plan, thus moving victory away from the better deck and toward the better player. In this sense, randomness also makes for a richer brewing environment, since players unable to guarantee the best possible hand every single time delve into theories and strategies to maximize consistency. No deck is better than every other deck in an absolute sense, thus spawning multiple decks that strive to be this theoretical and unreachable best. The other reason we want randomness in card games, in your opinion, is that it makes for more fun, tickling the gambling region of the brain where we manage to pull off a win against the odds. But as we know, all of this comes at a price because randomness giveth and randomness taketh away. A very frustrating aspect of card games for most people, one you need to learn to tolerate, is once again the randomness. You couldn't draw the cards you needed when you needed them, while your opponent drew exactly what they needed when they needed it. How rude. You lost, not to your skills being bested, but to the whim of Lady Luck. This is why many card games will give you access to counterbalance the negative aspects of randomness, like mulliganing. But unfortunately, there seems to be no straightforward solution to that dilemma. So where do we go from here? Okay, a lot to bounce off of. I'm going to organize this parlay into kind of three chunks. The first one is a little bit on what I think are the origins of shuffling in trading card games, because I don't think it's only for game design utility. You'll see what I mean. Second, most of the parlay responding to what you said about why you think randomness benefits card games. I kind of agree and disagree with a few points. So we'll talk about that. I'm very happy you gave an example that makes it really easy to get into discussion quickly. And then some of the drawbacks, most of which I agree with what you said. I think a lot of them are kind of obvious, but there's a discussion about whether it's kind of worth it. Okay, so the why randomness bit. Again, it might seem like, what do you mean? Where does randomness come from? Well, it's randomness. It's an elemental existence in game design. But I wanted to point out that I think if you think of the original deck of playing cards, 52 card playing card decks that are popular all over the world, these are shuffled to some extent because many of the games that you play with them arguably wouldn't exist if they weren't shuffled. Poker or blackjack, for example. In theory, if you knew what order the cards were in, it would just be a game about counting how many cards had been dealt, and then you would know exactly what every single card was if the deck wasn't shuffled. You could argue that the only reason there even is a game, blackjack, is because you shuffle. And the cards are all in one place. There's a balanced, standard, single set of cards that can be manipulated to create various games because they're sort of perfectly balanced, not choosable or modifiable, although you could take cards out, and you shuffle them. I think that it's important to keep in mind that games like Magic the Gathering, for example, which came out like 30 years ago, that game had access to a much smaller pool of design ideas than we have right now. People just hadn't thought of as many good pieces of design as they have today. And so a lot of the things that Magic does may have been done for reasons quite far away from modern game design ideas. For example, lands in Magic. If you're not familiar, in Magic you need to play land to draw energy from to cast your spells. Many similar card games have you gain one kind of mana source every turn. So on turn 1, you get 1 mana. You can play 1 mana spells, 0 mana spells. Turn 2, all your mana refills and you get 1 more. Turn 3, it all refills and you get 1 more. They do it like that. And indeed, a lot of the time in Magic, it is desirable to play. You can play 1 land per turn, and so playing 1 land per turn is good. But it introduces some problems where you need to draw a mix of land and non-land cards to be able to do much. Advanced Magic players, I know, but give me a break here. Most of the time, that's true. Which is, I would argue, bad in some ways. In the bad section about randomness, we'll talk about that more. But one benefit is that the land resource, the mana, not being abstracted, it's in the player's deck, means their deck is kind of the only game piece they need. It kind of does that thing like with the standard playing card deck, where all the game pieces are there. Now, to record your life total or whatever, you might write it down, you might have it die. So technically, people usually use some other game pieces. Magic could, I suppose, have abstracted that. But making everything fit neat and tidy like that seems elegant in the analog age, when you're not going to play it as a computer game most of the time, right? When you compare that to, well, the digital version of this game, we can just abstract mana. I think in that context, it begins to feel a little weirder that the player has to get the resource that lets them even play the game. Like, why? That sort of comes into question more. Do you see what I mean? There are advantages, I think, to actually putting the land in your deck. The fact that you automatically gain mana up to whatever the cap is in many of these digital card games has its drawbacks from a game design perspective. We're not going to get into that now. That's outside the scope of this parlay. I do think there are benefits to land in Magic. It's just an example meant to illustrate that the reason that randomness or like drawing a mix of lands and non-lands may be in those games may have little to do with it being better for the game mechanic gameplay. It might have just had a sort of tactile or pragmatic utility. The appeal of having everything seemingly elegantly kind of fit into one deck of cards. I think that that's a major factor to consider. And I think that's a good starting point. As we transition into discussing the benefits of including randomness, I also want to point out a few benefits that kind of aren't related too much to the discussion we're going to have. There are things that make the game better in some way, but not really its game design. They just kind of make it a game that will be more successful because most people are not laser focused on the game design of the game being good. Many people don't play games to play a good game. They just play it to have fun somehow, not really related to game mechanics. And the big one for Magic and for random games is allowing the unskilled player to win every so often. Like a party game mindset, it's nice if everybody attending the party can win every so often. I mean, I actually don't think that's nice. I don't have any friends that want that because I don't like that. But most people seem to. Most people don't exacto knife their friends out of I don't know, having the same exact preferences or whatever. But I'm crazy and I do. And so most people at most parties are, you go to your local game store to play Magic or whatever. And you will win some of the time as long as your deck has the basic pieces needed to win, because your opponent will eventually just not draw the right mix of lands and creatures or draw no relevant, threats for the early turns of the game, and you'll run away with the game. I think that is purely bad from a game design perspective, but it has some marketing appeal. I personally am going to argue that that's the kind of thing where I would rather the game be more focused. I think that most card game design isn't good for the casual player, so they should mostly give up on being good for a player that is really not pursuing skill at all, and they just want that player to win sometimes. I feel like that's a bad compromise in these types of games. These are not generally very accessible games in the sense that you generally need to learn a fair number of different cards and mechanics and put a deck together. And even then, there's a lot of the skill evaluations involved are fairly complicated. These don't seem like the games where it would be good to make a sacrifice in the name of the extremely casual player. I love including people in games, but it's all a balancing act of making a game not sacrifice what makes it good for the people it's trying to be good for in the name of trying to appeal a little to everyone. And most commercial products that are trying to appeal to everyone will make that trade off, even though I would argue it's pretty clearly not good. Um, it's not hard to design a game that can be accessible for everyone, but I think lots of types of experiences, it's very difficult to lose nothing while making the game accessible to everybody. And I think that I don't know what to do about that. I'm not saying that's good, but I think it is worth acknowledging. I think that the ability of a player that doesn't really do anything that good to occasionally win is a great example of something that is bad about shuffling in these games. And I'm going to go on to argue that shuffling is basically an imperfect game design piece that is there because we can't think of anything better yet. Um, but it does have its benefits. So, as I go through the main body of this parlay, we're going to talk through BlackSheep's benefits of randomness point by point. I'm going to say what I think. I want you to keep in mind that my shtick is that I think it's not bad. It's just not great. You could come up with something better. It pretty clearly is a kind of janky compromise, in my opinion. And it would be good to come up with something better. I'm not sure people have. So we'll get into it. Okay. So Black Sheep, you said, I think I said Blacklam a minute ago, which is uh, your name on Twitch. So I'm going to read again a little bit of what Black Sheep wrote and respond to the points as we get to them. So you said, your opinion is that first and foremost, randomness has the function of creating an even playing field for all players. This is because in a perfect world where all things are fair and balanced, shuffled, random decks give every player equal chances of enacting their game plan, thus moving victory away from the better deck and toward the better player. But I feel this is just patently untrue. If everybody draws exactly what they would draw, then every player is 100% guaranteed to enact their game plan. Decks that are shuffled can only possibly make it less likely the player will get their game plan immediately. Now, I think it's complicated because you may mean this in the sense of delaying a combo player from just immediately drawing their combo, which makes it more likely that a less optimized strategy will be able to enact its game plan before a more optimized strategy would have if they didn't have to shuffle. You see what I mean? So it's tricky. In some sense, the making it so you draw the exact cards you want every single time clearly makes it all about the player's skill because there's simply no randomness. If every player can have every card in a card game, let's just waive cost. You don't have to buy cards. You just get every card, and you can make any deck, and everyone knows all the cards. We're hand waving all those things. A high level tournament play basically, and you don't shuffle. Well, you're 100% guaranteed to see every deck do what it plans to do. Players will simply not bring decks to that tournament that intend to do something that they know they won't be able to do because their opponent is going to do something faster. There will only be decks that will do something quick enough that it will be able to be done without, any randomness. Like the cards they draw right away will be that strategy, and then they will do it immediately, and then someone will win. You're going to go on Black Sheep to make a point about how that increases the diversity, basically, like creates a richer brewing environment. And I think that's clearly true in this sense that many strategies just obviously won't be able to compete if you draw exactly the cards you want every single time. Only strategies that are very, very fast will be able to compete in that environment. It seems like the type of cards you would design for that environment, it's complicated. In fact, let's momentarily simulate what that type of meta might be like. So we go to my weird card game tournament where you can stack your deck and you draw 7 cards, the 7 cards you want every time. You draw the god hand every single time. And then you go. And everybody knows what cards their opponent. Well, they don't know exactly what 7 cards you'll pick, but they know of all the cards. People who've played tournaments before, so they have an idea of what you're going to use, unless you found some rogue thing that no one else has found. Okay, what happens? Well, let's broadly define three approaches the player might take. All threats, that is, every single card that they draw, is intended to be a meaningful threat to their opponent losing the game right away. Basically, all creatures or minions in a lot of games. There's another one that is the combo deck. The deck plays a group of cards which maybe individually wouldn't have been very strong. They will lose to the all threats deck if they played only one card, for example. But because they get to draw a few different cards, they can combine a few of those effects to create a combo which, if it goes off, will make them win the game. We're oversimplifying here. And then there's going to be a control strategy. This strategy wins slower than the other two strategies, but it has tools available to stop a few of the things the opponent does. So the combo deck will probably lose to the control deck because the control deck has the inevitability and can stop the combo deck's threats from being very powerful. The control deck will probably lose to the all threats deck because they won't be able to stop. They have to have some things that are their win condition. The all threats deck will eventually ask enough questions to get a moment where the control deck cannot answer. If almost everything in the control deck is a card that answers a card from the all threats deck, eventually the threats deck will have asked more questions and will probably win. Most card games are designed so that all things being equal, you will win if you play in a more aggressive strategy. The control deck has as the kind of burden of proof that it has something it's actually going to do. And the answers are more specific. Eventually, the all threats deck will ask a question the control deck cannot answer, and then they will die. Just as a simple example, that's good enough. And then, of course, the all threats deck will lose to the combo deck because the combo deck will win on turn one, and the all threats deck doesn't have a thing that will stop them. If the combo deck somehow didn't win on turn one, then the all threats deck would win, I suppose. But that's, this is a simple example. The thing that's bothering me, I guess, about this discussion about that being that randomness makes that good is that Magic, for example, or a lot of card games I've played, what I just said is the situation in those games. It's just abstracted a bit because you do shuffle. Shuffling doesn't make it that it isn't true that those decks generally beat each other. It just makes it like less extreme, I guess you could say, which you could argue is good, but I'm not so sure it is. I want to keep tracking the benefit of the shuffling. We've definitely removed any clear kind of rock, paper, scissors, if you want to say it that way. But I want to keep tracking what the benefit of the shuffling is exactly. Making a game where you have absolute control over what cards you draw without thinking about it enough that you're sure you've planned for that in the game design seems problematic. But let's check what happens now that we've made those players shuffle. Okay, so the all threats deck can pretty much keep doing what they're doing. The control deck kind of gets a leg up because they can hide the minimum amount of win conditions, cards that will make them eventually win the game, in an ocean of answers to their opponent's threats. So the likelihood that they will fail to answer every single question the opponent's deck asks has gone down because they can play almost only cards that do that, while playing very, very few cards that make them actually win, but they will eventually probably be able to just play that card and win. They can play ludicrously expensive threats that will take forever to get enough mana to cast because they can stall basically forever, all things being equal. And they don't have to focus on trying to kill the opponent. The opponent just will die. They can take it as a given once they get far enough in the game. In a game like Magic, it's even possible that the control deck doesn't have to play any threats as per se, because there are some lands that will be able to generate enough, a very little damage to the opponent, but enough that the control deck will eventually whittle them down. The combo deck is probably going to fill the rest of their deck with stuff that gets them their combo. You could argue the combo deck loses the most in this abstract example. And I would also argue that it's the combo deck where we see that maybe diversity of strategies isn't increasing as much as you would think. The combo deck might play a wide variety of cards, but not that matter. Like, they're gonna play a bunch of cards that dig for their combo, not a great variety of other cards. They might play some aggressive threats or efficient threats or things that draw them cards in interesting ways or something, some removal to slow the opponent down while they draw their combo. Yeah, they'll probably do that stuff. But overall, the combo deck is more or less going to play yeah, like their combo and cards that are basically their combo pieces. They're going to play as many cards in their deck that are their combo pieces as possible. I would argue that didn't increase the deck diversity that much. What I'm arguing here, just to recap for a second, isn't that the shuffling didn't increase build diversity. It obviously did. There was pretty much none before the shuffling in that example. I'm just arguing that if the purpose of the randomness was to increase diversity, it doesn't do a very good job. Like, that's not a good way to increase diversity. I guess that's what I'm saying. In fact, I would argue that once you've made it so players can't get exactly what they want, the less randomness you introduce, the more diversity you get, as long as you don't make it 100% guaranteed that players get what they want. And I'll explain why. A lot of strategies just won't have enough consistency or threats to fill out a whole deck. Because you can't guarantee the cards you draw immediately, you basically need more cards that do the thing your strategy wants to do, which means that the number of strategies that have enough gas, I guess, to put in their deck to draw relevant stuff is smaller than it would otherwise be. A more reliable game, or I guess where you draw more cards, basically, would allow more strategies to flourish while avoiding the problem of allowing the combo deck to get their thing immediately, right? So drawing more cards, letting you replace more cards. Duelist 2 comes to mind. Anyway, if you've seen that game, a card game I really like that does those things. Once the game isn't completely deterministic, once there's some randomness, I would argue it's actually the less randomness there is, the more diversity the game has, provided there is some randomness. And so that brings up the question, well, where is the threshold where randomness begins decreasing diversity instead of increasing diversity? You know, that you could get crazy about this. You have I guess three tools. You have your hand size, your starting hand size, your deck size, how random is the game? Do you shuffle or not? Do you get to mulligan how often and how many cards? How many cards do you draw? Those are all knobs you can turn to increase or decrease the randomness. And so if you have infinitely little randomness, you don't shuffle, your starting hand is big. So that kind of decreases the not randomness, but you can do almost whatever you want on turn one is the point. You draw your whole deck right away, and because there's no deck, there's no shuffling. I guess that's what it would be. Or you don't draw your whole deck right away, but you can stack it as much as you want. That could be meaningful. Like, those games would be different, but that is maybe too random. And so what's the least randomness we can introduce? And does that increase or decrease diversity? And is that even good? That's not even the whole story. But so I guess it would be you could shuffle your deck, but you do pick your opening hand. That doesn't seem random enough. Or your opening hand is random, but you can stack your deck. That's interesting. You could maybe do something like that. This means that the combo deck won't win literally right away most of the time, but they can stack the deck and put their combo on top. Combo decks are very useful for this mental experiment. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, wow, maybe it's that. That's the you draw a random hand, but then after drawing a random hand, you can stack the rest of your deck. But that feels impractical. Like it would take too long, I guess you might say. You could maybe do a priority order for cards. That might work. You could, in a digital game mostly, you could tell the game what priority order you want cards to be stacked in within reason. But usually what games will do is, yeah, you'll turn the other knobs because they're more practical. You simply draw more cards and you can replace cards more often, greatly magnifying the degree to which you're closer to having stacked your deck, but you didn't have to actually stack your deck, I guess. That's interesting. So again, I would argue it's not so much that I disagree that adding the randomness increases build diversity, like it does, uh, but not having more randomness. And basically, I don't think it's for the reasons you discussed. So when you said um, uh, randomness makes for a richer brewing environment since player is unable to guarantee the best possible hand every single time, delve into theories and strategies to maximize consistency. That doesn't really that isn't an increase in diversity. That means players have to not play different things. They want to play as many cards as possible that are the same thing as a card they already play, even though technically it's a different card, basically. Just sort of pad their deck with duplicates of an effect. If you play Magic the Gathering, which I've been using as an example a lot, you know this is a fairly major part of the game. Adding redundancy or more copies of an effect to your deck is generally how the most powerful strategies fill out their deck. There's very few powerful popular decks that succeed by playing a very wide variety of cards, which there is no analog to that card anywhere else in the deck. A one of that isn't played anywhere else in the deck, and the deck doesn't have a way to just go find it. You know, most of the time you see a one of that has no similar card to it anywhere else in the deck. Most of the time you see that, it's because the deck is full of cards that let you pick any card you want from your deck. And so they added a bunch of variety. But there really isn't only one of that card. They play cards, the purpose of which is to make it so they're actually playing like 9 of that card, you know? Um, I would argue that does not increase diversity at all. It just encourages players to make decks that are as close as possible to being a deck where you can draw the hand you want every single turn. And again, if you've played Magic, I think that will ring true for you. It'd be much more consistent if instead the game, I would say, basically forced you not to do that. Like there were either no cards that did that, or but then the game would feel really inconsistent, and so or the game would let you draw more cards or replace cards more often. The game would pull back the randomness from fully shuffling. So I would argue that full randomness or more randomness doesn't really increase the amount of variance or the amount of agency the player has. It just encourages them to unengineer that piece of game design, to kind of find the way in the game that you can most ignore the fact that you have to shuffle, which I think is one of the least interesting things about Magic, where you spend most of your time making most decks, trying to find a way that you don't have to play Magic the Gathering, and instead you can just draw the hand that makes you win right away. There can be some interesting stuff that happens in there, but you get my point. My takeaway is that the line where randomness is having a positive effect versus a negative effect is weird, right? There's a point where you add randomness at all, and suddenly the game kind of exists, like we were talking about with the standard playing card deck. But then after you've done that, adding more randomness arguably makes the game sort of pointless or less about player skill, um, which I just think is weird. That's fascinating. I wouldn't have thought of that way before. Um, the gambling thing. I think this is its whole intertitle, and then we'll move into the negative things because you could argue it's a negative thing. The gambling appeal bit. I think that the good version of this is this sort of freestyling or improvising that card games can be really good at, where they they encourage the player to figure out what combination of the cards they've been given out of all the possible combinations is good. That is fascinating. I think there's a lot of genuine mental stimulation there. It evokes the thing with shuffling the standard playing card deck where you add a lot of variance with the same game pieces. It gets you a lot of mileage for the same game pieces, and it rewards creative thinking. Can you think of a way to sequence these cards, this combination that you could never possibly have predicted you would have, in a way that is to your advantage in this match? Stuff like that. The negative version of it, though, I think is when the game doesn't allow it, it's very random, but it didn't allow the player enough control of the randomness some way or another to the point that the player got a big enough benefit from just putting a kind of I hope I draw this card in their deck that they occasionally just rip it off the top and win. I'm definitely guilty of playing this strategy. There's a mechanic in Magic called Miracle These cards have a special little border around them when you turn them over to help you remember. Right when you draw them, at the beginning of your turn, you can play them for a much cheaper, very aggressively cheaper cost. They'd go from maybe 6 mana to 1 mana. And I played Revenge of the Hunted, I think it's called. 6 mana normally, 1 mana if you play it immediately with the Miracle cost. And the purpose of this card was strictly I couldn't get it reliably. My deck didn't really have any particular synergy with it. It's just so good when it's good that the game kind of encourages you, oh, just put these in, and every so often you'll just explode your opponent's entire life. And that is exactly what it did. It was wonderful in that my deck could reasonably cast it normally. So it wasn't the end of the world if I drew it and didn't miracle it. But there was almost no situation in the strategy I was playing where you wouldn't want to play it right when you drew it. And it would almost always be catastrophic for your opponent. You do so much damage for so little mana and basically pay no cost whatsoever. You don't have to plan around it really. But it was powerful. But I would argue there wasn't much. Why was that in the game? Like there wasn't much game design benefit to that. It basically just meant that strategy that could play that card got a buff, but in the most frustrating way possible, like in the way that had the least to do with player skill. Why not just design a card that's more interactive that does that thing? I don't know. I don't agree that that is a good thing that they added to the game. I played it. I won money in a tournament for playing it. So in my defense, I played this in the context where you would play like the sweaty thing that makes you win, but isn't that fun? And it was fun in a very childish, casual way. It's not like I didn't smile like, oh boy, I'm sure gonna hit this guy in the face when I peeled it off the top. Sure, but that would get old after like one tournament. You know what I mean? Um, some folks might enjoy that for a little while, but it would get tiring. It would get boring. I don't think there's much game design uh, goodness in there. I think that's all the examples I have about that. But yeah, the sort of gambling uh, thing. I think you can pull off a win against the odds with high consistency as long as there is a little randomness. And just recombining different orders of your cards is enough. I think that's enough. I'm very interested in the way in which you can turn the knobs I described before. Your starting hand size, your deck size, how many cards do you draw per turn, to what extent can you mulligan, and how many copies of a card can you play in your deck. You can turn those knobs in various ways to tweak the experience a little bit. For example, I think an interesting one is to let the player draw more cards, but let them play less copies of a card in their deck, which I feel like overall makes the game more consistent, but you have to improvise more. Like you will get whatever's in your deck, but you can't rely on like a single combination matters less and less because you have very few redundant copies of it. You can only play 2 copies of a card rather than 3, but you draw 3 cards per turn instead of 2. Obviously, this has other game design consequences. It's hard to balance a game similarly to other games that have come out with mana costs and stuff. If you make the player draw tons of resources, like that definitely changes that. But it's interesting how you can tweak that randomness to give the player the most agency with the least, kind of bad randomness, I guess, possible. So let's briefly talk about that negative randomness, although we've kind of merged into that already. The gambly thing, obviously, I do think there's a big attitude issue for a lot of people. This kind of goes away once you honestly grow up, but it's a problem for a lot of players, which is that they tend to blame their losses on the randomness while claiming their winnings as their own agency, when the truth is they don't really know which it was. And this leads into a bigger issue, which is that a lot of the time it's not clear how often you did lose because of the randomness or not. It can be difficult to understand when you should actually react to feedback when playing a random enough game, because it's not clear whether that just is the 30% of matches you would have lost. Again, something that might not be as familiar to people who don't play card games or whatever at a medium level is that the decks that are really popular and dominant don't win that often, that consistently. they win, maybe 2/3 of the time, would be like a crazy high win rate. They still lose a third of the time. And that deck would be considered to be like the best deck to play. So if you didn't know that or you didn't think that way and you played that deck, you're going to lose a third of the time. It might not feel that different than playing a deck that is much worse, right? But still wins like 45% of the time, which isn't good. Your deck is making you more likely to lose when you do that. And yet it would probably not feel drastically different to some people. You're meant to kind of ignore those times when the game is just sort of like doing the statistics to make you win the right amount of time. This is something I felt drove me crazy in League of Legends, where I would argue at a lot of levels of play, not at high levels of play, but that doesn't matter because almost no one is there. At a lot of levels of play, for the average player, the worst player and the best player in a match are really the only players that matter because the worst player dying makes the game sway in the other team's favor. So your own skill is only actually being checked in practice one of every 10 or 5 matches, depending on how you think of it. Which means that most of the time that something goes badly, you're meant to just sort of ascend past mortal desire and pretend that game didn't happen, basically. Statistically, it was insignificant, but from a human perspective, most games of that game you play are not there to evaluate your ability. So if that's something you cared about, you could just not play ranked. But anyway, it you don't matter most of the time you are playing, which I would argue that's just the biggest possible failing of game design. There are many benefits. There's the party game benefit again. The best player on your team can carry the whole team in theory, and then you could all maybe have fun. I would suggest just hanging out with some drinks, but I really hate League of Legends, so I I'm not here to tell you not to play it if you enjoy it. Fine, um but that's a big problem, both because it's not psychologically pleasant to most people and because it just doesn't really seem necessary. Like, why not play a game where you win because of you more of the time? Why would that be anything but good if you want your skill to be evaluated? If you're not playing the game to evaluate your skill, why play this type of game? Why play a game that so heavily involves your skill, among other things? It just doesn't really make sense. Like, that seems very suboptimal. Like, it's a game that hasn't compromised well for what thing it's who it's trying to please. You could think of it that way. So that's a big negative for me. And again, I think you can eliminate it quite a bit by just toning back the randomness. Lands are another big example in Magic. I do think there are some positives. We really don't have time, but the idea that the player needs to draw a mix of land and non-land to be able to really play. Again, experienced Magic players. I know that's not the whole story, but it's most of the story, to be fair. That makes the problem much worse. It's much more common for even a very good player in Magic to just straight up have to quit because they cannot play the game because this is the match out of 10 where the game simply doesn't work. Imagine if you played a video game where 1 out of every 10 matches, it just straight up broke. The game just didn't work. That would be such a high point of failure, most people wouldn't agree to play. And yet, there are many card games where that is the case. It just might not quite seem that way on the surface. I want to leave with something I thought was really interesting when I read this parlay. In Magic Arena, one of the online versions of Magic, uh, the game has a shuffler that biases your opening hand for certain combinations of cards in your deck. It tries to give you a more playable opening hand with a good ratio of land to non land. And I think it's interesting how we agree that it's good for you to get a good ratio of those things. But if you were to make a system that reliably gave you a certain ratio of those things, at that moment it becomes exploitable. And then it's kind of a problem again, because you've given the player something too close to being able to draw whatever cards they want at the beginning of the game. Does that make sense? I thought it was funny how we all agree we want that thing, but if we get that thing directly, then it gets out of control. It's a problem immediately. Having something that kind of vaguely does it may be the solution in there. So, as a couple of takeaways, one, I think having some but very little randomness is a large boon. You don't need a lot to make the game do the thing. Two, a lot of the reasons why you'd want randomness, I would argue you could actually solve those by not designing cards a certain way. For example, in Duelist, there just aren't really two card combos that make you win the entire game. You could simply not design those cards. You could just not design cards that do that. And then you could go back to my example where the game is totally non random. You have your ideal hand every turn. And if you don't make it so there's a way for the player to win the game on the spot, maybe that's okay. There's a benefit. The player is absolutely guaranteed to do what they want to do. The only reason they weren't absolutely guaranteed to do what they want to do was because of the combo deck. So when BlackSheep earlier said, in a perfect world where all things are fair and balanced, shuffled decks give every player equal chances of enacting their game plan. They don't, of course. If you get exactly your game plan in your hand every turn at the beginning of the game, that gives you the highest chance of enacting your game plan. The only reason it doesn't is because of decks that will win immediately if you let them do that, right? And then your game plan has to be either winning immediately or stopping them from winning immediately. But if you just make it so nothing wins immediately, well, then you should be able to just get your game plan right away and play it. I would argue that many of the most popular, I guess, variants of card games do this. For example, in Magic, one of the most popular formats nowadays is Commander, where you get to start with your Commander creature, usually outside of your deck, but your other 100 cards, your other 99 cards, are completely random. You only get to play one copy of each. You probably plan to draw a lot of cards, but you get one card totally guaranteed. Since there's no one card that's going to win you the game immediately on the spot, you can't play a combo that will always immediately win you the game right away. And then it gets into what Black Sheep talked about earlier with, now that they're not completely consistent, various decks have various advantages. If they're disrupted, this deck is more resilient, but this deck can combo off more often, but not 100% of the time. And so there's room for a trade off there. And yeah, that's true. I just think it's interesting to consider how it kind of isn't because of the randomness. I would argue that that gets better. It is very related to other pieces of game design. But yeah, it's fascinating how there's this threshold where once you add a little randomness and then as little as possible, but still a little bit, enough, but then no more. I feel like that kind of makes those games as good as they can be. There are benefits to not making the game consistent that way, but I don't feel that they are good compromises for this type of game. It'd be better to make a different game that was trying to do that better. For example, if you want to make the game even more random to create even more randomness, you wouldn't allow the player to play 4 copies of a card in their deck and also make a bunch of cards that do the same thing as each other. That just doesn't really fit that design goal. Why leave it so up to chance whether the player will make a reliable well, I mean they're going to make a reliable deck, but you get the point. It just feels a bit contradictory. Magic here has been pulling a lot of weight as an example because it is trying to do a lot of things at once. And I don't think it's entirely fair to critique Magic for that. But I do think it's not good, really. It's just the hard to fault compromise that isn't really like any good compromise isn't really good for anyone, but it makes everyone perfectly unhappy. Of course, the best compromise was where you gain almost everybody gets their whole outcome. Yeah. And I just don't think that does that. I think that's all I have to say. Yeah. A really, really interesting parlay about a very sweaty topic, the role of randomness in these games. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's difficult to unpack because there's a lot of different factors. Like it's hard to use an abstract example without having a game by which you to kind of discuss this topic. I almost want to make a whole game just to explore that, where you can change, the starting hand size and redesign cards and stuff. And you could see how you could make different versions of the game that would be good and a bunch of versions of the game that would be bad by tweaking those knobs in various ways. That's just fascinating. And of course, people will like different ones for different reasons. So yeah, I hope you feel I was able to tackle this in a worthwhile way. This is a good parlay.